Good afternoon. Welcome to the fourth lecture in the lecture series on global populism. I'm delighted to see you all here because this is a busy time of the semester for me, and I'm sure it is for you as well. So far, we've had three great talks about various aspects of this phenomenon of global populism. And last but not least this semester, it's my pleasure to introduce my esteemed colleague, Professor Julio Carrion. And I'm very grateful, Julio, to have you as a colleague because you expressed very early on an interest in this subject matter. You emphasized that this is very important, that we need to improve our understanding of populism, of global populism. So I really appreciate that, and I'm very interested in learning more about populist governance in Latin America. You've been working and publishing on this for a long time, I believe for at least a decade, if not longer. You're an expert in Peruvian politics and Latin American politics, and you've published also on populism in Latin America. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that this is part of a book manuscript. That is
pretty much a summary of the argument.
A summary of the argument for the book manuscript. So do still buy the book. Do buy the book. Don't write so, obviously. But this gives a glimpse into what will be in Professor Carrion's forthcoming book. Just very quickly, why is this important? Why should we care? Obviously, Latin America, an important part of the world. And not only that, at a recent conference, at the International Studies Association conference in Baltimore back in February, my dissertation advisor, Professor Peter Katzenstein from Cornell, told me that he had the sense that maybe we in the United States were being Latin Americanized. So he was fearful.
So he's also worried about the incoming of Mexicans into the country.
No, not in that sense. That was not his fear. His fear was not of immigration. His fear was extreme political polarization and corruption and high levels of inequality would become, or were already becoming, endemic features of governance in the United States of America. And maybe we should wake up to this fact. Anyway, that is not, I don't want to throw that out there and distract us from the subject of our talk. So I will shut up here. I've talked too long, which is an academic problem. And the floor is all yours, Professor Carrion, and I look forward to your talk. Hopefully we'll have an interesting Q&A afterwards. And grab a flyer. We have some great talks coming up in the spring. So I hope you'll join us for those as well. Thanks so much, and please welcome Professor Julio.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Would you mind raising your hand around 3:35 so I know where I am, so I don't take forever?
Okay, 3:40 maybe.
Okay, 3:40.
So it's already 5 after 3.
Okay. So welcome. I really appreciate your presence here. This, as Professor Kinderman said, it's the summary of the book manuscript. I've been working for a few years now. I have about 2 chapters left, and so that's why you cannot buy it yet, but hopefully this will be done by before February or March of next year. So let's. Populist governance in Latin America. Can you guys recognize the person who is on the picture there? Yeah, Hugo Chavez, right? Well, that picture was taken in 2002, a couple of years after he took office. He's holding a little parrot, and of course, the cute thing about it is that the parrot also wearing a bonnet, just like he was doing during that particular rally. Okay, so. What is this book about? What I am interested in doing? What is my research question? The research question that I pose is, why does populist governance take root? Why and how? How it does, right? As you know, if you have taken a history class or a political science class in Latin America, the region has a troublesome history of democratically elected presidents that once they take office, they dramatically change the rules of the game. That implies, of course, changing the constitution or amending the constitution so that if, for instance, they were not allowed to run for immediate re-election, they change it so they can be re-elected. Once, twice, sometimes even 3 times, like the son, right? I mean, there are presidents who actually have changed the constitution in such a way that they eliminated completely term limits, right? Venezuela did under Chavez, where presidents can run indefinitely for re-election. So why is this problematic? Why are we concerned about populist governance? It's because I argue that populist governance is a different kind of governance. It's a non-democratic form of governance. And that's what I'm going to explore at the beginning of this presentation. In what sense democratic governance is different from populist governance? And how does it happen? You know, how does a country transition from a democratic form of governance to a populist form of government? And why does it sometimes fail? You know, one of the points that I will raise is that not all populist presidents, not all populist governments, not all populist governments turn or end up into populist governance, right? There is a process that may lead or not to the establishment of populist governance. My focus is on how populist presidents actually rule, not why they are elected into the first place. Now, in Latin America, we have a long tradition of populism that goes back to 1920s, 1930s. And there is a very extensive, very large literature on the topic of populism and why populist presidents are elected. I'm not interested in trying to understand that particular question. I think that has been a topic that has been extensively researched. What I'm more interested in is in exploring and analyzing how populist presidents actually rule. You know, what are the characteristics of the rule? And of course, there are a number of studies on how specific presidents rule. But what I'm trying to do is set a collection of populist presidents and examine their trajectory and how they went from being democratically elected in the first place. George, you want to sort of take center? Yes. Yeah, that's our dean of the. Now I'm getting nervous. I know. I might ask you to shake hands this way, you know. So that's what the focus of the presentation is today, to explore issues of governance, not why populist presidents are elected in the first place, right? So even though the topic is Latin America, obviously Latin America, South America in particular, is a very large region. And so I focus on a specific set of countries, Andean countries, which are highlighted in yellow there, that have a recent tradition or a recent experience with populist presidents. All of them, in chronological order from the left to the right. Alberto Fujimori in Peru, elected in 1990, currently in prison in Peru because of corruption and genocide. Hugo Chavez, elected initially in 1999, passed away in 2013. Álvaro Uribe, elected in 2002, ended his second term in 2010. Evo Morales, president of Bolivia, elected initially in 2006, still president. He lost a popular referendum last year. The popular referendum was about whether he will be entitled to run for a third re-election, his fourth term. He lost it, but now he's pushing for a constitutional amendment that will actually allow him to overrule that referendum and run again next year, on the grounds that, you know, the referendum is violating his human rights. And I'm not kidding you. I'm not kidding you. That is actually the legal, you know, argument, that preventing him from running violates his human rights. And then Rafael Correa, elected in 2007, who just left the presidency in February. He was hoping that by electing a successor, his vice president, he will be the power behind the throne. He's currently in Belgium. His wife is from Belgium. And he was hoping that he would return after the term of Lenin Moreno, that's the name of the new president, and he could run for election again. Now, with a constitution that actually allows indefinite re-election. After 2017, any president in Ecuador can run for permanent re-election. So if you notice, Álvaro Uribe has a little darker box under his name and in the country. And the reason is that of all those cases, he is the one that tried but could not establish a populist governance, a populist form of governance. He was prevented from having an additional term that the Constitution did not allow. So in technical terms, he is my negative case. I have 4 instances of positive populist governance, and I have one case where a populist president couldn't establish a populist form of governance. And that's very important for my theory, as you will see. So what are the goals of this presentation? Very quickly now, since I have already talked about it. First of all, I want to provide a definition of what is governance, what is populist governance, and what are the differences between populist governance and democratic governance. Then this is the core of the book, which is advance a theory of why populist governance takes root, right? Focusing on the Andean cases. So this is a theory that comes from a careful examination of the 5 cases that I'm discussing this afternoon. How does it evolve? Why does it take root? And then finally, probably in a much shorter fashion, to sort of examine the factors that affect the durability. What are the factors that favor the continuation of populist governance? What are the factors that undermine the continuation of populist governance? So let's start. A little definitions. We political scientists, social scientists, we live and die by our definitions. So we need to sort of make our terms explicit. What is governance, right? Governance, in general, can be defined as the manner or way in which the state steers society. So this is about the steering, right? How do we actually conduct the affairs of the state? And even though there is a very close connection between governance and governability, which is probably a concept that you are much more familiar with, they are different. Governability is about the ability to actually govern, right? And the ability to govern is an important part of the definition of governance, but it's not all of it, right? Governance, more specifically, is about how the head of government, in this particular case, presidents, steer the other branches of government, the judiciary, the legislature, and society. So it is, my study falls within what in the literature on governance is considered or is known as governance with government. And that's quite appropriate for the Latin American case because presidents and presidential systems are quite dominant. In the European sense, if you were studying governance in Europe, they tend to prefer the analysis of governance without government, right? So it's more about how organizations self-regulate, how institutions self-manage. They don't pay much attention to the role of government in governance, which I don't think is relevant to study the Latin American case. So I'm embracing a conceptualization of governance where the government is central, right? Is central. The emphasis is on processes, not on outcomes, right? And this is because in many of the international organizations, we usually read and hear the term good governance, right? My analysis of governance is not whether it's good or it's bad. That is focusing on the quality of the policy products, right? That's not the concern that I have. My concern is more about how the rules for governing are established and managed, right? So it's about, once again, steering. It's the process, not the outcome. Of course, if the process is flawed, is not transparent, most likely the policy outcomes are not going to be that great. But that's not the emphasis. So I'm not judging whether the policies of the presidents were good for specific purposes. What I'm judging is whether they were democratic or not. That's basically the focus of my presentation. So what is the challenge of governance, right? The challenge of governance is that on the one hand, you have to empower governments to rule. We want effective government, right? We want governments that rule. But on the other hand, you have to create, or you have to establish, you have to restrain that power. And if you have taken a political philosophy class, you will recognize immediately that that statement, the last one, comes straight from the Federalist Papers, right? That's exactly what Hamilton said, right? The great challenge of governance, he didn't use the term governance, he said government, is to empower the government and at the same time to control it so it won't abuse us, right? So that's the challenge. So this study focuses on some generally important, enduring issues of political philosophy, of political theory, right? How do we create governments that are effective, but at the same time don't abuse their power? So what are the dimensions of governance? I identify 4 in the book, right? State capacity, which is the ability of governments, the central government, to govern. That is equal to governability. So governability is a dimension of governance. The second one is accountability. The different ways in which we can hold our leaders accountable, right? And in the literature, you find usually 3 types of accountability. Vertical accountability, which is just basically the power of voters to eject their leaders at election time. That's what vertical accountability is. Horizontal accountability, which is basically a fancy term for check and balances. And then societal accountability, which is a term that comes from the Latin American literature, which basically is about the ability of social organizations, civil society organizations, to check the power of the state, right? NGOs, oversight organizations. That's what societal accountability is all about. The third dimension of governance is conflict resolution. What is the style and processes that governments use to manage conflict? Because politics obviously is about conflict. So the question is, how do you manage conflict, right? It's through accommodation and compromise, or is through confrontation? And I will argue in a minute that populist governance is about confrontation. It assumes a confrontational policy-making style, whereas democratic governance is about accommodation and compromise. Finally, the other dimension of governance is transparency. To what extent the rules are public, to what extent the rules are transparent, to what extent there is due process, to what extent the policies that the state implements follow the due process, right? Just because the state has the power to do things, there are certain areas in which the state should not impinge upon. That's the idea of due process, right? It's a basic conceptualization of the liberal state, right? The difference between the private sphere and the public sphere. Okay. So here is the contrast between what I argue is democratic governance versus populist governance, right? In democratic governance, you have a strong decisional power, the ability to actually make decisions. Now, not usually, but in the Latin American cases, not always, democratic governments have a strong decisional power. So democratic governance might be a little weak along those lines. But the point is, that in a well-functioned democratic system, governments are effective. They have the ability to rule. They have governability. Populist governance, almost by definition, have a strong decisional power, right? Because populist governments are transformational. They challenge the status quo, and therefore they need enough power to make those changes happen, right? So that state capacity is very high under conditions of populist governance. It's in the second dimension, on accountability, where you see the major difference between populism and democratic governance, right? Populist governance tends to have weak accountability, either vertical, horizontal or societal, but especially horizontal accountability. Check and balances are problematic under conditions of populist governance. Conflict resolution. Democratic governance is about compromise and judicial adjudication, right? Because here is the core of pluralism. Pluralism is equated with democratic governance, and under a conditions of pluralism, is about finding the way that works for all of us. Under conditions of populist governance, the mentality is confrontational. Populism tends to demonize the enemy. So there is no room for compromise with your enemies. You can compromise with your opponents, but you cannot compromise with your enemies. So populist governance, it's confrontational. It embraces a very confrontational style because almost by definition, populism requires an enemy. There is always an enemy to which we need to confront to the death, right? Transparency under conditions of democratic governance, the policy process is largely transparent, whereas it's not so much with populist governance. So let's keep moving, right? So to just define very quickly populist governance, that comes out of my manuscript. The primary policy objective of populist governance is to reproduce itself, which means to extend its term in office as long as possible, right? With a very important proviso. By keeping the veneer of democracy. You need to keep the veneer of democracy. You need that patina of democracy to address populist governance. But populist governance hollows out the content of democracy, especially by reducing, even eliminating accountability, vertical accountability or horizontal accountability. Populist governance demonizes the opponent and embraces a confrontational approach to policy making, right? I already mentioned that. And finally, it adopts a style of policy making that is both opaque and dismisses of due process, which of course encourages corruption. But that's, I'll get to that in a second. Okay. Now, a little, maybe I shouldn't spend too much on this, but for those of those who are more familiar with political science, it's important to make the distinction between populist governance and another concept that has become quite popular recently, which is the concept of competitive authoritarianism, which is a term that we use to describe governments such as Putin's in Russia, Alberto Fujimori in Peru, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and most of the former Soviet republics. These are regimes where you have elections that are to a certain extent competitive, but it just so happens that the opposition always loses, almost by miracle, right? So they are not, entirely democratic. They are not entirely authoritarian. They are hybrid regimes. So in what sense is populist governance different than competitive authoritarianism? Well, they refers to different levels of analysis, right? Populist governance, or the notion of governance, is about the manner of ruling, how government steers society, whereas competitive authoritarianism describes the nature of the political regime. And what is a political regime? Well, the political regime is the rules, the characteristics, and the resources that actors use to gain and maintain power. So they are different. They are related. Governance and competitive authoritarianism are related, but are different because they are speaking of different levels of analysis. Populist governance is more on the policy dimension of the regime. So it is not the same as a political regime. It's more at the governing level, right? I know it's a little theoretical, but it's important to make the case that the concept of competitive authoritarianism stresses the hybrid nature of the regime, the combination of authoritarianism and democracy. Whereas, and not all competitive regimes come from populist governance, right? There are different trajectories where a government can become a competitive authoritarian. For instance, through the transformation of traditional authoritarian regimes that gradually democratize. So they do not become democracies overnight, but they are more democratic than they used to be. right? Whereas populist governance, although doesn't necessarily descend, not always turn into competitive authoritarianism, it has been described as a primary catalyst for competitive authoritarianism. So the idea here is that not all competitive authoritarian regimes are populist, but many populist regimes descend into competitive authoritarian regimes. It's a little bit for the political scientists. Now they're happy, can go home and don't criticize me. Okay, we come to the core of the presentation, the dynamics of populist governance. How does it evolve? How does it take place? Okay, 3:30. What is important here is that populist governance doesn't happen overnight. The election of the populist president does not mean that you are going to have populist governance. There is a process that leads to that, or it may not. The point is, it's not automatic. There is a process, and a process in time, right? Politics matters. The key idea here is that politics matters. Yeah, a populist president might like to monopolize the political game, might like to turn democratic governance into populist governance. And it's going to happen only if other political actors allow the president to do so, or if the president is able to impose his or her will. It's almost always men, so I'm going to use the mass, his will, right? So politics is significant. Public support, public approval, popularity is very important, especially at the beginning of the process. But so is the actions and the decisions and the choices of other elite actors. And by elite actors, we're talking about political parties, we're talking about the military, we're talking about security forces more generally, we're talking about the judiciary, we're talking about even members of the president's parties, right? It's the action of the elites are important in the final outcome of the process. And here is something that is usually not stressed in the literature, right? The literature on populism usually focuses on the leader-mass equation. What I try to do is to sort of switch the focus a little bit and examine how other political actors, how other elite actors interact with the populist president. And even though in almost always the establishment of populist governance is a non-lethal process, meaning no people are significantly killed, it's not violent, it frequently requires the naked mobilization of state capabilities and a state force, right? The use of the police, the use of the military, to do things that are not so quite as killing, but to basically impose the will of the president. And I'm going to explain a little bit that when I get to the specific cases. Now, populism doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? There are certain preconditions, especially in the Andes, in Latin America. The first one is mass discontent. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that. People are unhappy for a number of reasons. They might be unhappy because the government is unable to defeat a domestic insurgency, like it was the case in Peru and in Colombia. Or they might be unhappy because there is a significant performance failures. The governments cannot deliver economic prosperity. The reasons for mass discontent vary, but there is always a significant mass discontent that sets the process, that starts the process. But it's not only enough to have that, you have to have the second step, which is elite disarray. Political elites are incapable or are no longer capable of channel the political representation within the established channels, right? Because of previous performance failures, bad governments, because divisions, because fragmentations, but they cannot. It's no longer enough that, voters vote for party A, and if the party A does bad, they vote for party B, and after the party B does really bad, they go back to party A, right? That is no longer enough. Now voters want a party C. They are not just happy with party A and party B. And there are some attitudinal and institutional manifestations of both, of mass discontent and elite disarray, right? Political dissatisfaction. The polls show, how unhappy people are with their political institutions. Electoral volatility, so voters switch parties back and forth very rapidly. The rise of outsiders. All of these populist presidents that we are studying were not outsiders, or even examples of what was called an insider-outsider, somebody who's an insider but runs as an outsider. Fragmentation or collapse of party systems, political instability. Between 1996 and 2007, Ecuador had 9 different presidents. In less than a decade, Ecuador had less than 9 presidents, right? They were deposed left and right because of a series of events that, obviously I'm not going to describe now, but that's an example of political instability. Okay, so now we move to the dynamics. I identify analytically that there is a consistent dynamic in this process of populist governance. There is an initial moment, which I call the tsunami moment, where people all of a sudden rallies behind the populist leader. There is a second moment, which I call the Hobbesian moment. It's the moment of political confrontation. The opposition and the government duke it out. There is a confrontation that becomes a zero-sum game. Either the government prevails or the opposition is able to control the president. And then there is a final moment, which I call the populist moment, when now we have, because the presidents have succeeded, have overruled and defeated the opposition, now they are able to establish the populist governance, right? So in terms of the in graphical terms, that's the dynamics, right? On the y-axis, you have political hegemony that goes from low political hegemony to total political hegemony. And on the x-axis, on the horizontal one, you have time, right? The 3 moments that I identify. The tsunami moment, the Hobbesian moment, and then the populist moment. So there is always this launch of the populist candidate. All of a sudden it takes, it becomes a tidal wave. People all of a sudden rally behind the outsider. And once he is elected, goes into the battle zone. Is the moment of fight with the opposition. It's what I call the Hobbesian moment. The outcome of that moment determines whether you get populist governance or not. If the president succeeds, then the political hegemony continues increasing until you get populist governance. If the president is defeated, then you go back to politics as usual. So the president loses political hegemony, there is an election of a new president, things go back to normal. Right? That's the dynamic I identify. The tsunami moment. Populist candidates generate a significant level of support because voters are tired, right? And their election puts radical political change on the agenda. And notice that I always talk of political change. Populist leaders are not about social and economic change. They are about political change. What they seek is not to install socialism or more egalitarian societies. What they seek is to increase their political power. That's what they do, right? That's what they seek. And support for the populist candidates comes from a variety of sources, the disaffected masses. Some professional politicians who think that, well, now maybe it's the time where I should jump into the bandwagon. Some intellectuals who honestly believe that the situation of the country is so bad that it doesn't really matter if we go for the outsider, because how bad could it be? It cannot be worse than what we got, right? Minor parties associated with the old order that start guessing, oh, maybe if I hitch my luck or my fortune with a new populist president, maybe we can enhance our influence, right? And that tsunami moment, that political momentum that comes from a massive election, produces some short-term impacts, right? So some media outlets offer, if not outright support, at least sympathetic coverage. You know, the support changes the political calculation of some sophisticated political actors. I mean, in political science, there is a very vast literature on how public opinion changes the calculation of sophisticated actors. And that enhances the possibility of political reform. Presidents are elected, and their dynamic is such that it's easier for them to cower the other state branches or other political actors so that they can have that change. Now, that graph summarizes pre-election polls before each of these presidents were elected. Look at the dynamics. They all start from a very low base. And then all of a sudden, 3 or 4, not months, but pre-election polls before the election, they shut off. It's a tidal wave, right? The darker line is the geometric mean of all the pre-election polls, but the pattern is exactly the similar for Fujimori, Chavez, Uribe, Morales, and Correa. They start around 10%, 12%, and then all of a sudden, by the time they are elected, their pre-election polls show them around 50% of support. So this is not a situation where, you know, some candidate starts with 35, 36%, and by the time he or she wins, he was able to increase the support to 40 or 42, right? This is a tidal wave shape that increases the political momentum. It's like a fever that catches most of the population, right? Okay, the Hobbesian moment is the moment of conflict, right? It's the key moment in the trajectory of populist governance. Because inevitably, always, the president's efforts to increase his political hegemony, his political control of the system, is going to be confronted by actors that feel that they are losing in that equation. So the political conflicts is going to happen as sometimes the judiciary or other political actors start confronting the president. Now, the temporal gap between the tsunami moment and the Hobbesian moment might vary. In some countries, it takes almost no time. It's a matter of weeks. In other countries, it takes about a year or two. But there is always that moment that analytically you can say, okay, the opposition woke up and is now confronting the president. And that's the moment when you basically move into a zero-sum competition. Only one of these actors can prevail. Either the president prevails or the opposition prevails. Okay. The problem is that governments in Latin America have a significant set of advantages. They have the upper hand for a number of historical and institutional reasons, right? They can use the naked state power. It's hard to believe, but in 2007, President Correa wanted to impose a referendum to ask people whether they wanted a new constitution. And he sent a bill to Congress to that effect. And Congress said, well, maybe we'll do that, but this Congress is going to keep existing, and we're going to set a very clear limits of what that referendum is going to be. And Correa said, hey, hell no, I don't want that. I want an all-powerful constitutional assembly. And in a virtual circular fire situation, institutions collapse because Correa basically sent supporters and members of the police to block the congressional building to prevent members from the opposition to actually come into Congress and vote. And that's how it happened, right? I mean, I don't want to get into all details. We can be here until 8 o'clock. But almost like that happened also in Bolivia, right? And because you have hundreds of mass supporters that encircle the congressional building to force senators from the opposition to vote their way. And that's what I mean by the naked use, the use of naked state power. Once presidents succeed, then we have the emergence of what scholars call the super presidency or the hyper presidency. And I'm going to go into detail in 1 second. So very briefly, I promise, no more than 1 minute per case, right? The Hobbesian moments in each of these 5 cases. In Peru, it was April 5th, 1992, when he shut down Congress, dismissed the Supreme Court, and decided to rule by decree, after 1 year of confrontation with Congress. The big surprise was that Fujimori thought that he would need to use the military to basically restore order on the streets. The surprise was that people were quite happy with that. 80% of Peruvians approved what Fujimori had done, right? That's how he cemented his power and won that Hobbesian moment. Venezuela, Chavez. Early 2000, he released a number of decrees, legislative decrees, that the power for doing so has been given by Congress, but he issued a number of decrees that were so far-reaching that the opposition realized finally that Chavez was about to really monopolize the political power. And so a fight ensued between the opposition and Chavez to have a recall election. The ability of Chavez to delay for more than a year the recall election allowed him to win that recall election. And the ability to delay the vote was because he already had full control of the judiciary and the electoral board. And why was it so important to delay that vote? Because at the beginning of 2002, the price of oil was about $25, $30. In 2004, when the vote actually came in, the price of oil has shot up to close to $80 per barrel. And he was able to use that windfall to fund significant social programs and buy the vote of significant number of Venezuelans, right? Colombia, that's the negative case. Congress had already given a bill to change the constitution so that Uribe could run for re-election again in 2010. He was having an 80% popularity approval across the country. The deal was almost done. The people were happy, Congress was happy, but it was the constitutional core that says, no way, you cannot use the people, the vote, to change the constitution in such dramatic fashion. You were elected for 1 term, you change the constitution to be elected for a second, and that's as far as you're gonna go. No 3rd term. And to his merit, he had to accept the decision, and then he left after his term was over, and now, was replaced by President Juan Manuel Santos, who was later re-elected. Now, Colombia today has banned the re-election of presidents, right? It's the only country in Latin America that is going the other way, whereas most Latin American countries are enabling subsequent re-elections. Ecuador, I already told you the story, same with Bolivia, right? So you have these moments when presidents are able to impose their political will over the opposition and succeed in the Hobbesian moment. And that's when we have the super presidency. Ooh, 45 minutes already. The super presidencies are this set of, it's not your normal American presidency, Trump could only wish to have a presidency like that, right? A super presidency has been described by Fish when he was actually analyzing the Russian case as a situation where you have an oversized presidential power, both formal and informal powers, with legislative powers, right? That's the key difference. Presidents have legislative powers. They can enact laws. Presidents control the state purse. They can actually initiate expenses, either through formal or informal rules. They have basically no opposition in Congress. You have a completely emasculated legislature, and then a partially or totally controlled judiciary. That's a situation of the super presidency, and this is the mechanism that will bring you to the 3rd moment, the last one, which is the populist moment, right? Now, at this moment, presidents may or may not be popular. It doesn't matter. They already have a full grip on power, right? So popularity, public approval becomes much less important because at this moment, presidents have already full control of the regime. Their hegemonic position encourages other actors, private actors, to support them because they find that it's beneficial to them to make business with the state and a president that is going to guarantee them profits. And the weakening of check and balances and the lack of transparency creates an environment where corruption happens. It's corruption. It's not just an incidental feature of the regime, but it's a central feature of the regime. And the more people are engaged into the corruption networks, the better it is because everybody is guilty and nobody has, therefore, an incentive to change the regime because they will be prosecuted for corruption, right? It's a perverse, I scratch your back, you scratch my back type of situation. It's like in the Duma today in Russia, right? Every single member of the Duma in Russia is guilty of something. And the only reason why they are not in prison is because Putin doesn't want to. But he knows what are the crimes that they have committed, right? And so he can use that at any moment to send them to prison. That's the best way of buying political loyalty. So the pattern of confrontation deepens. The regime now moves against the press. It moves against the opposition, civil society organizations, and even dissidents from the own internal movement, right? It's no longer to have just some support. You have to have full support of your loyalists. And the judiciary becomes an instrument of the government. It becomes an instrument of repression, of political persecution. And due process basically disappears, right? And you have an opaque policy process because there are no checks and balances. Okay, I'm rushing a little. So in summary, this is the causal change of populist governance that I identified in my book, right? It starts with these preconditions, mass dissatisfaction and elite disarray that leads to the election of a populist leader. Then you have the moment of institutional change, the Hobbesian moment, and if the presidents prevail, then a super presidency takes place, and that would lead you to populist governance. Right? That's the causal path of this. Okay, so what are the factors that contribute to the stability of this type of regime? And I'm going to take no more than 5 minutes, I promise. Enhancement of state capacity, right? You cannot have populist governments or governance without effective governments, right? And so when you increase the state capacity, this type of governance is likely to remain. You have already buy significant political support and loyalties because basically you have created a vast network of patronage that fosters that type of support. The opposition is disoriented. They don't know what to do. Plus, the opposition, it's an abuse of the language, right? There is no single opposition. There are oppositions. They have different ideological perspective. They might be more radical, less radical. And so the opposition, even though we're using that term as a singular, it's really not the opposition, right? They are divided too. They don't know what is the best strategy. I mean, look at Venezuela today, right? I mean, where the opposition is in total disarray. And so that helps stabilize populist governance. The anti-status quo discourse fosters this us versus them polarization. I don't care if you are a child molester, but you are not the other, right? So therefore, I'm going to support you, no matter what, because it's either us or it's them. Yeah, you as some of us might be a little difficult to swallow, but at least you are not them, right? So that polarization fosters that type of loyalty. And then, of course, a largely hands-off regional context. Other governments don't care unless the abuses become too obvious, as it has been the case of Venezuela. So what are the factors that sort of undermine populist governance? Well, the strong emphasis of personalistic leadership prevents the emergence of a strong team, right? It's either the president, his personality, or nobody else, because he doesn't want to have any competition around. So that's a structural problem there, right? There is no team because there is no party. Most of the time, there is no party. There is a tension between having a good economic policy, but also the need to fund social programs. And it's this tension that also undermines populist governance, because these governments need the two of them. They need healthy economic policies, and they also need to fund the social programs. But sometimes one comes into contradiction with the other, and that's a problem. The issue of succession is critical, as always is with regimes that are sort of hybrid, right? Where it's not very clear how do you succeed the leader, how do you replace the leader. And that's where, because every re-election becomes a moment where you can end the regime, where you can put an end to this. And even though the opposition is weakened and the government is stronger, there is always a possibility, right? Because these are not openly authoritarian regimes. The elections still matter, even though most of the time the opposition loses. And if the president decides to step aside, as Correa did, things might turn out differently. Correa thought that he was going to be the strong man behind the throne, but the president today has a different idea about it, right? And to the extent that he just sent his vice president, who is Correa's man, to prison because of corruption. The current vice president of Ecuador is in prison because of corruption. So the new person can become his own person, his own man or his own woman, right? And so that also undermines the stability of populist governance. Unless you can appoint somebody like Medvedev as your president, and you become the prime minister, and then one term later you switch roles, right? Or your daughter. Okay, it's the bloom of the rose. What about populism in the Andes today, right? So there are some factors that undermine the persistence of populist governance, the end of the commodity boom, right? Today are not times of economic growth and economic bonanza in Latin America. So governments have less money to fund social programs and populist programs. The exhaustion of the confrontational discourse. After a while, people get tired, right? It's just, and the point is, you cannot have the same enemy for 10 years, for goodness sake, right? I mean, if your enemy has been not been defeated after 10 years, how good are you, right? So that's the problem. And you cannot switch enemies in between. You cannot go from criticizing the political class to a different kind of, now criticizing, I don't know, illegal immigrants or something like that, right? So it's a problem there. The middle class becomes this unhappy. The middle class withdraws from this type of regimes. And then today, the main concern in Latin America is crime, which is a kind of difficult issue to turn into a populist appeal, right? It will have to be a more sort of right-wing type of populist speech. It's just not, it can be done. Uribe did it in Colombia, but it's not that easy. So I finish now, finally, with possible trajectories, right? So populist governance can descend into open authoritarianism, as seems to be the case in Venezuela. I mean, today, we are just living a situation where Venezuela is on the verge of being just another Cuba. I mean, it's just, it cannot last. Right? Or it might evolve into a hegemonic party system, a la Mexico. Mexico lasted for 70 years, this type of regime. The president was president for 6 or 7 years, and then will be the regime became intact, but the personality changed every so often, right? So now it's not individual rule, it's hegemonic party system rule, and that's a different type of regime. Bolivia seems to be a good example for our candidate for that, right? It might turn into that. It all depends. If Morales pushes his third re-election, he might abort this possibility, because people might get so angry that they just decide to vote against the party, period. And that will be the end of it. Or it can gradually weaken and sort of becomes, more normal. It's still with a strong populist governance tenor, but less so than it was in the past, which I think is the case of Ecuador, right? Okay, that's it. I'm sorry I have to rush at the end, but yeah, 45 minutes, about 50 minutes. That's all. So now. I know it's a lot, and I packed a lot, but.
I look forward to buying and reading your book, Julio. This was a great talk, lots of food for thought. I think a lot of us were also wondering, okay, this is Latin America, what about us here at home in the United States? I look forward to an interesting discussion. We have time for Q&A, so yeah, whoever wants to ask a question, please just raise your hand and go for it. We have one, whoever.
Okay. Andy, you want to go first?
Yeah, kind of along Dr. Kuhneman's question about the so what. My question is about generalizability.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like this, you look at more recent time periods, a pretty specific set of countries that have specific preconditions. So kind of, what are some of the lessons we can take thinking about populism in a global context, and especially maybe what these, it seems like the preconditions are very important, right, for all of this to kind of happen. So that really interested me in terms of kind of this like meteoric rise, right, the lottery ticket of these candidates, these political outsiders who are purely interested in winning politically, not interested in talking about the issues. So some of that rhetoric is, right, happening in the United States, but what could these conditions look like in other places?
Mm-hmm.
To talk about the generalizability of this, or for explaining past populisms in other contexts, either in Latin America or in other
yeah. So that's a good question. So the first one is that this theory has been developed under situations of presidential systems, right? And it's very unclear how will that play out under parliamentary regimes. And in fact, I've been thinking a lot about this, and I'm coming to the conclusion that maybe Juan Linz, a famous political scientist, was right by saying that it's very difficult to have authoritarian regimes or even this type of populist governance under parliamentary regimes because of the nature of the political system. So I think the applicability is limited to presidential systems or semi-presidential systems like in Russia, right? But that's still a significant. There are a number of countries that fulfill that criteria. I think that it can also easily apply to other Latin American cases that I haven't analyzed, like the Kirchners in Argentina, for instance, where they were populist, but Argentina didn't turn into a situation of populist governance because, first of all, they came from an established party, so therefore there were other factions within the party that act as a check. And so it didn't descend into this kind of populist governance, which is consistent with my theory, which is that this could happen only if other political actors allow it to happen. And I think it can easily be expanded to some historical cases with the following proviso, that in the past, at least in the Latin American past, the Hobbesian moment was sometimes, or most of the time, between the populist president and the military, because the military was the conservative actor. And in most of those cases, the military won because they have the weapons, right? And so, yeah, I think there is a significant potential for generalizing this theory. But also some important policy implications. The most important policy implications is that don't go home and cry after the election of the populist president. That's the job just starts that moment, because you can have the opportunity to prevent the worst consequence of that, which is the establishment of populist governance, right? Now, there are some factors that I haven't mentioned because they are incidental, but one of the assumptions behind the theory is that the presidents are more or less competent. that they have more or less the ability to increase their political capital rather than to diminish it. And what is significant is that in all these cases, the popularity of these presidents was very high 3-4 years into their terms. I mean, we're talking 60%, 70%, in some cases 80% popularity approval. So it's very important because for many political elites, the approval of the president sends a very strong signal. It's like, I am better off supporting the president than opposing him.
And just to kind of follow up, did they often, like in the four positive cases, was there always, like you talked about commodities, was there always kind of a capitalization on the good economics?
Yeah, in all cases,
yeah.
with the exception of Venezuela.
Okay.
Because in Venezuela, Maduro, it was so incompetent that he basically, I mean, the regime was already into trouble, but Maduro, I mean, after all, he's a former truck driver. I mean, that was the only qualification that he had was that at some point he was Chavez's chauffeur, and that's why he wanted him to replace him, right? And we can see that the collapse of that, what is happening in Venezuela. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Without overstating it, if you look at Peru, the Indian, so-called European difference is so significant. I mean, they supported the Indian, quote, rural population, supported Fujimori,
right,
even though they knew that she was corrupt and she was going to let her dad out of jail.
Right.
So to what extent is that a factor in, say, Peru, or I don't know about Ecuador, but it's certainly
yeah.
Peru.
Well, it's in the case of, you're referring to Keiko Fujimori, Alberto Fujimori's daughter. Yeah, she tried to steer this populist message from the center right, which was about security. I can deliver security that these democratic governments have been unable to, and she almost won the presidency. Yeah, so I think it's effective. It is effective. The problem was that Peru had the experience of her father, so many people were not willing to give her the benefit of the doubt because they were concerned that she might reproduce the type of government that her father had, right? So, yeah.
50% support.
Yeah, that's true. But you need 50% plus one. She lost the election by 41,000 votes. I mean, it was that close, 41,000 votes out of 18 million people voting, right? It doesn't get as close as that. Jesus.
Yeah, I'm trying to put these things in
historical perspective. I wonder why.
I wonder to which extent in your amazing definition of modern populism, this populism of the recent years, to which extent political culture doesn't play a role here also. And I'm thinking, that in Latin America there's a long history of caudillism,
right.
Right. Tradition. So does this play a role in all this scheme? That's one question. And I have another question. What's the role of ideology in all this? Because you're using 5 cases which are ideologically very different from each other. I mean, we have
exactly.
Fujimori and Uribe, who are neoliberal.
Yeah.
And then you have 3 presidents that are more kind of
left wing.
Left wing, right?
Right.
Some of them actually very leftist.
Yeah.
So this two
Yeah. So about the first one, no question about that the region's predilection for caudillo rule is very important, right? And especially because it explains the type of presidential systems that even under the best times are highly centralizing, right? So yeah, personalistic rule, it's a trait of Latin American history, but this goes way beyond personalistic rule, right? It's extreme. So, but obviously it's a factor. But it's the reason why I work on 5 countries that are similar. They have similar historical trajectories, similar political cultures. The Andes are a recognizable sub-region in Latin America, so it's a most similar systems type of design with a difference in the outcome, right? Now, your second question was about the ideology. Yeah, the only ideology that they share is that they want power and they want more of it. I mean, that's and the rest is just window dressing. But and that might be a very realistic definition of politics, but I think that's basically what it is, right? I mean, Carl Schmitt is a very famous German political philosopher, defines politics as us versus them, right? It's just a confrontation between, it's the dynamic of friend and foe, right? It's just, and I think they personify that. It doesn't matter whether you're coming from the left or you're coming from the right, or you have no ideology. It's about enhancing political power. And I have a wonderful citation from, what's this Mexican writer, Paz, who basically, who basically makes that argument, right? Politics is the best way to look at politics is like a war where you have, two armies confronting each other. It's a very depressing way of looking at politics. Yeah.
Have you found that any of these leaders legitimately care about the disenfranchised masses? Like they see it as a justifiable means to an end?
Yeah.
To break these down, to help those people because the political elites were not?
First of all, I don't think that the political elites, you can argue that they didn't care. They were not effective for a number of reasons, but I wouldn't argue that that all of them didn't care. Some of them did. They just failed. Now, it's always difficult to sort of examine motives because how do you do it, right? There is no evidence to see. So what were the true motive of somebody like Fujimori or Hugo Chavez or Uribe? All you can do is actually assess what they do, right? But it was very clearly the case that the policies that they adopted to benefit the poor had a very clear political calculation. And so whether they did it just because it was a calculation or because they really care about the poor is an open question. I think it's a combination of both. What they didn't care was about democratic rules. That was very clear. And I think that's what I'm trying to say.
Can you say something about Brazil? It's quite dramatic right now, what's going on, but it looks like the new regime is more corrupt than the old one. It was the move because of corruption.
Yeah, I don't think there was populism in Brazil, right? I mean, Lula was not a populist. Dilma was not a populist. The reason why they were not populist because they were members of this party that has very deep roots into Brazilian society. Now, the problem was, in the case of Brazil, is that these constructing companies, Overdeck in particular, use the profits of the company to bribe so many politicians, not only Brazil, but everywhere. And it doesn't matter whether they were populist or non-populist. The only countries, I think, that are clear from these corruption accusations are what? Chile, Uruguay, maybe Argentina, although Argentina had local grown corruption, so they didn't need the Brazilians. But everywhere else, and African countries, right? I mean, they also corrupted. The problem is that, in general, the democratic governance in Latin America is not that great to begin with. It's not that, good. And so there are many problems. These governments made it worse because they sort of change the nature of the political game where it's very difficult to eject them, right? They come to power through clean and fair elections, but they do not live through them because it's almost always, with the exception of Uribe, you always have to have an extra institutional mechanism to end their governments, right? And question, yeah.
So I know after Chavez died in, what was it, 2012?
13, April 4th, March 4th, yeah.
Big drop in support for the whole Bolivarian revolution
Yeah.
that was going on. Do you think that was more based on Maduro's lack of like his personalistic traits, how Chavez was kind of like a cult of personality, or would you say it was more the economic problem?
It was more of the economic. It was already, the regime was already declining. The last election Chavez won, the margin of victory wasn't that great as it had been before, but it was just just to give you a number, the barrel of oil went from $130 to what, 35? So it was a significant drop. The resources weren't there, and now Venezuela is on the verge of financial default, which is going to be, it could be the end of the regime. It could, you know. Yeah, so I don't think that the regime was already having troubles. Chavez stopped governing for the last 2 years because he was so sick. But at least he was very charismatic. He was very, he had the ability to mobilize people. Maduro doesn't, right? I mean, he has the charisma of, you know, the leader of a funeral parlor.
I'll ask you the same question I asked the guy who came and talked about the Philippines. It strikes me that a common pattern for why these regimes develop, like Putin for me is the classic, or maybe Erdogan, is that people get into power and they start to really accumulate wealth as a result of that power. I think Putin is the richest man on earth now. And then they can't leave power because they'll lose access to the wealth, and probably they'll be prosecuted for the crimes that they committed in the consolidation of power and the pillaging of the state. Is that a factor common?
I think it's a byproduct. It becomes a factor later on, and that's why they want to extend the rule for as long as possible. I don't think the motivation is I don't think the reason why.
Fortunes behind all of these men? Fortunes, basically?
No. At least not in the case of Correa, that we know. Certainly not in the case of Uribe. Fujimori, he's in prison, so yeah, obviously there was a lot of corruption there. And Maduro, Maduro, he knows that, yeah, there is a lot of corruption there in the case of Venezuela. But I think that once they move into the populist moment, they are trapped, right? There is no way to go. I think that was the calculation that Rafael Correa did early this year, because he could have easily engineered another re-election. He could have done it. But he also knew that Ecuador was going to face significant economic troubles, which are happening right now. And I think he thought, maybe this is the moment to get out, because nobody's going to request my head. I mean, nobody is demanding that he be back in Ecuador to face trials for anything, right? So he's happy in Belgium. He probably just left at the right moment, hoping that he will come back. I don't think he's going to, but you know, he did. Now, in the case of Fujimori, he was trapped. He was trapped in all this corruption network. Yeah, you can. I use the term trap, but I mean, obviously there was a decision there, right, to use corruption. But I don't think the motivation to enlarge their political power, which happens in the Hobbesian moment, is based on the need to profit. I think it's more that the idea that either I win or I'm going to be just another president, and my term is going to go, and then I'm, you know. So yeah, that's. It's
another thing that happens is you get tired, right? You run out of ideas, you're exhausted, you want to leave power because you're sick of it, but you can't do that if you have $500 million in the Swiss bank account and your kids are all corrupted, and you know. So then you have to stay in power. Now
you have to stay in power and probably die in power. I know, but that's
Yeltsin did that.
Yeah.
Yeltsin was extremely corrupt, and he was replaced.
Well, but the reason why Yeltsin appointed Putin was precisely to cover his corruption.
That's how you change.
Right. That's exactly. You know.
You can leave if you find a stooge.
Right. So that's why Vargas Llosa defined the Mexican case as the perfect dictatorship, right? Because the dictatorship was the dictatorship of the party. The president controlled everything, but only for 6 years. After 6 years, it will be another guy And so, yeah, he had carte blanche to steal, but he left because he knew it would be somebody else's turn. Now, nobody tried to undermine that system because it was the best way to enjoy your profits in retirement. But that requires a system that is institutionalized, right? That requires a political party that sets the rules of succession. That's the problem with these types of regimes. The succession becomes moments of crisis because it's not clear how are you going to replace the leader without the whole system coming down. And that's usually the problem with, unless you're in a system like China, it's very clear. It's the party decides, or Cuba, or North Korea. North Korea is the family, right? So unless you have very clear lines of succession, you have these moments of crisis. And that's the difference between traditional authoritarian regimes where you have very clear lines of succession and these hybrids where you have to have elections. And the elections have to be more or less meaningful. You have to have them. And that's the moment where things could happen, right? Because as we know, sometimes the electoral results don't go the way we expect them to go or want them to go, right? Now, the US case is a little bit more complicated because there was no tsunami moment. The tsunami moment in the US case happened during the primary system, right? But once you go into the actual election process, it was, some days it was up and down, up and down. But Trump lost the presidential vote. We tend to forget that. He lost by 3 million votes, right? So he didn't have the political momentum that all of these presidents had because in almost all these cases, you also have a two-round system. So they have to get to 50% or more. Otherwise, they won't be presidents, right? Although some of them didn't need that. I mean, Morales and Uribe, they cleared the 50% mark easily because of the great momentum. So, and they remain popular. So imagine how the situation in the US will be today if Trump's popularity rate was about 75% instead of 38%, right? How that will change the political calculations of political actors or the judges for that matter, right? So just think about that, right? So there are certain factors, political factors that enable this, but it's not only the motivation to profit. Yeah, Flavio.
Trying to think of, in my head, trying to think of a difference or how this applies to, let's say, the modern presidency and an evolution of power.
Oh yeah, you're a president expert, of course.
Well, so I'm wondering, like, you note on extending term limits, right? The ability to realize, that seems like a core component of your theory, right? So are there other, it seems like, is that a necessary?
No, it's the super presidency that is the core component. Is this type of a specific presidential power where the president is the only game in town.
So there are other, so I mean, I wonder maybe you can flesh out, like, what are some of the other expansions of presidential power that, so aside from the ability to keep running for re-election, are there other, like, things that are, like, clear red markers for you that says we're moving into a new type of sort of super presidency or something like that?
The fact that all policy initiative comes from the presidency rather than the legislature, the fact that you have the ability to control and appoint who is in the judiciary. What other, the fact that you...
I'm not saying there has to be other ones,
yeah.
but I'm wondering, are there other, like, big red markers that sort of say, like, yes, this is, like, so even if, is it possible to have, let's say, populist governance without the extension of this term limits? Is sort of, I guess, my thought. 'Cause I'm wondering, I'm thinking of, like, the American progressive movement with, like, Teddy Roosevelt and then Woodrow Wilson. A lot of the markers you talk about.
But I don't think the extension of the term limits is a problem per se, because you have Angela Merkel in power for like 14 years, 15 years. Nobody's talking about populist governance in Germany. You know, exactly. So I don't think it's the extension of the term itself that is the marker here. Is the nature of the presidency that emerges as a result of constitutional change or political change. Sometimes it's not even, you don't even have to change the constitution because you have these informal rules that are, like for instance, just to give you an example, right? Mexico's constitution, the 1917 constitution, is almost a carbon copy of the US constitution. And so for 70 years during the pre-rule, you have a Supreme Court that was appointed for life, as which the supposition was, or the assumption was, a good check on presidential power. Well, it just so happened that every time a new president took office in Mexico, the Supreme Court resigned en masse. Informal rule. There was nothing written in the Constitution. They all resigned en masse. So the new president got to appoint them. The new Supreme. So that's what I'm talking about, right? So it's not.
Why did they do that? Was there some corruption behind it, or what? Why did that happen in Mexico?
Because in Mexico, everybody had something to hide. And so I'm sure there was some, something that they could have used. Maybe they just wanted to retire in peace. There was no re-election in the Mexican Congress. No Mexican member of the House or the Senate could be re-elected. And still, you have authoritarian regime that lasted for 70 years. Because of these informal rules. Yeah.
I have a question about the establishment of populist governance, and also about this idea of the kind of a Hobbesian moment. I think that we are right now in an era of sort of a Schmittian time. We are living in a Schmittian time. You can see signs of this all over the world, I think, or in many different places. And my question is, why is it hard for societies or countries or democratic regimes to withstand this pressure? Or often it's a very powerful movement in this direction. And the reason, of course, why we're very concerned about this is Carl Schmitt is not a democratic theorist. If you move into that world, democracy, bye-bye, right? You're in a different world, the world of the 1930s. That's why a lot of people, I think, are quite frightened.
So we're in the middle.
Why in some cases, right, is it just their incompetence, the elites are fighting, or there's enough resistance? Why are societies sometimes able to withstand this tendency, or this direction, this movement, this dynamic, and in many other cases it seems they're not?
Yeah, I mean that moved me. Yeah, I think to the extent, the paradox of all of this is that the development of democracy and democratic elections created an opportunity for this. Right? So it's a paradoxical situation where the more democratic the world has become, the fall of communism and all of that, the more opportunity you have for leaders that emerge from a situation of chaos and use that chaos as an avenue to enhance their political power. Maybe Linz was right. Maybe, because 90%, if not more, of the new countries that were created as a result of the fall of the Soviet Union adopted presidential regimes. Mm-hmm. Very few adopted a parliamentary regime. I cannot even cite which one. Maybe the Czech Republic was the only one, right, that adopted and so we are seeing this mostly in presidential systems. Now, there are tensions. Right. In some parliamentary regimes, but when a populist leader in a parliamentary regime takes over, there are a set of checks already that he has to maintain a majority. And so, I mean, I don't know very well the cases of Austria, but that comes to mind. Now, why is this happening? Well, we are living in this new moment of democratic erosion. I think that the demise of pluralism, right? The heighten of identities, which can go either way, right? I mean, I think identity politics was part of the problem in the most recent U.S. election, right? Yeah. Democrats assumed that identity politics will always work in their favor, and it came back to bite them in the you-know-where, So why is that happening? Well, a number of factors, right? So you have the decline of political parties, the decline of ideologies, the rise of fragmented markets, meaning like social media, the segmentation of the news media. So in a situation in which we're becoming more democratic, more autonomous, better consumers, well, not better, more consumers of news, you see this fragmentation where it's very easy to escape, dissenting views.
A simple explanation. What it is the informal U.S. process was controlled by Protestant elites, which had normative values regarding the public good. After Woodrow Wilson, who was a racist. But after that, through Roosevelt and even the Bushes, there was an assumption of informal Protestant elite, benevolent, or community-oriented values. Not necessarily the positions I would be in favor of in terms of their public policies, but in terms of their approach to power, there was this normative elite, and that's broken down among. It's not totally broken down, but it's substantially broken down.
But in the case of the U.S., once again, how many presidential systems in the world have a college, an electoral college? How many? It's only the U.S., right? And so in a normal democratic process, the president would have been Hillary, not Trump, because she won the majority of the votes. That would have been true in every presidential system other than the U.S.
But one of the reasons for that was the fear by Jeffersonians of the mass public.
Right. The 19th century liberalism. Right. I know. I agree completely. Democracy is the worst possible system, with the exception of the others. I mean, that's the Churchillian definition, right? Democracy sucks. The problem is that the other ones, the alternatives are even worse. So we're stuck. I mean, that's is either that or is going back to the state of nature that Hobbes talks about, right?
This is making me think that.
Good.
But there is nothing like a good parliamentarian monarchy.
As I said, democracy is the worst possible government with the exception of the others. Are you thinking of the Spanish case by any chance?
I'm thinking more other European cases.
Okay. Let's ask the Catalans what they think about.
Probably Spain is not the best example, but all things considered.
No, I know. I mean, but that is the. We need to go back to Machiavelli, right, and the Republican values, right? I mean, that's you can have Machiavelli argue, yeah, democracy is fine as long as you have the people that are a people that is worthy of a democracy, right? And so that's where we're failing.
Right. Yeah.
I think the answer is very simple. Populism feeds off mass discontent. That's what you said. So if we allow more and more inequality, then more and more people are unhappy, and that feeds populism. And that's what we see worldwide, the inequality.
So the basic reason is economy.
Right, right. But it can be used politically in so many different ways, right? So inequality can be used in the way that, for instance, Chavez used it to portray the Venezuelan elite as the enemy. Or it can be used by the way that some European populist leaders use to blame the immigrant, right? And not just immigrants, but Islamic immigrants, right? They are the bad ones. So, yeah, inequality obviously is a factor. The problem, the only thing that I'm saying is that it can be used, the political manifestations of that can be used in different ways. And why is that the socialists are having so much trouble? I mean, shouldn't be this the moment where, good old-fashioned socialist parties that are all in favor of democracy and reducing income inequality should be, So what is wrong with that? I mean, why is that people are choosing the populists rather than the socialists?
Only because politics tend to polarize.
Yeah, that's, and so obviously I don't get into that, but there is some, I mean, we are primates. We humans are primates. So there is inherent on many of us this Schmittian view that, is friend versus foe. Yeah, in and out, right?
Yeah.
It's the in and out. And in a cultural milieu where the in and out has become so extreme that it's basically the in of one versus the out of everybody else. I mean, there is such an individualization. I mean, talk about mass societies, right? Going back to the issues of sociology in the 50s and in the 60s, the emergence of mass society. I mean, that's where we are, people are getting closer in terms of the communication, but at the same time, they're feeling more isolated.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, those were actually golden years for democracy in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah.
Those decades.
Yeah.
We're moving on. Yeah.
Well, I was just gonna, because you have a somewhat complex model, and so I was trying to think of like which element is bearing the most explanatory weight in a sense.
Politics. Politics matters. I mean, that's what I'm trying to say, right? There is a process that starts one way, but at the end, you cannot predict who's going to win. You cannot, because there are no factors that will tell you beforehand. You can sort of guess who has the upper hand, but the outcome it's contingent. It's contingent of the actions of the individual. Who would have thought in January of this year that Trump would be in such a weak position today?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right.
I had an answer to my own question.
Okay.
No, because I think what you did put your finger on, there's a lot more democracies out there, so there's lots of democracies with very few institutions that can kind of provide checks and balances on these kind of initiatives, right? And so it's logical that there would be more kind of odd deviations from working democracy because there's so many weakly institutionalized, poorly developed democracies out there. And then I think the other thing was that factor you talked about of, like the existing parties' inability to deal with the frustrations of the people, so a disaffected people.
Right.
Right? But I think Trump's failures in office are absolutely predictable because we have a highly institutionalized political system in which
so did Venezuela. So did Venezuela. So did Colombia. Institutions are as good as good as they exist or as they long. Look at Spain today. I mean, I think it's going to end up well, but it could have ended up in completely different. And the only difference is because I don't think there is an overwhelming majority in the Catalan region for autonomy, for independence. That's the key, because it's probably the majority wants to stay in Spain. But if you have a situation of 80% to leave and 20% to stay, the outcome would have been completely different. So there are certain, I don't want to use the term structural, but
The power of institutions is important. And
Yeah.
you mentioned that in your presentation.
but the powers of
the division of powers
right.
is kind of a good medication
Yeah.
in our case, and in the case of many established democracies and healthy democracies. That's something that doesn't happen in all these
Right.
sort of dysfunctional democracies.
Right.
There's no division of powers. The judicial, relies on the executive. The executive rules over the legislative with political parties, etc.
Right. The Constitutional Court in Colombia went against every single actor, against 80% of the people who wanted to re-elect Uribe against. They did it.
Although Kim Shapili, the first speaker in this series, she said we should be cautious to conclude that the division of separation of powers through the institutions will save us. If there were very good lawyers working for the administration in power, she said things could change dramatically and radically.
But also public opinion. I think public opinion is important.
also matters.
Imagine a situation where the first policy initiative of Trump would have been infrastructure, rather than whatever it is, rather than a travel ban. And he would have brought the Democrats aboard and passed a significant transportation bill or infrastructure bill that would have, reduced unemployment.
Right.
His popularity rate will be in the 60s now, and
If you could take that way,
So
Yes, but that would have been a competent course.
Right, but right.
And yes, of course, if then he basically would have been dumping his populist inclinations, and he didn't do that, and so.
No, but
he's being checked by that.
I don't think that would have dampened his populist inclinations. It would have cemented them.
Exactly.
He would have
successful.
said, I'm walking away from my party. I'm working with the other aisle because I care about the people.
Yeah.
And he would have delivered for his base rather than the tax.
He could have managed it all better. So.
Yeah.
That's true.
So I think that is a variable that is difficult to plugging into an equation like this, right? Although we know that competence is important. But yes.
Well, anyway, so thank you so much for a
Thank you.
tremendously
Thank you.
stimulating